Hi, and welcome to Political Science 101, the history of the American political system. And today we are talking about Chapter 5, Civil Rights. And I'm your instructor, Jennifer Hobson-Plattner. Today we're talking about civil rights, and it's very important to know at the beginning of the chapter to understand what we're looking to learn about through this chapter. Explain the constitutional basis for our civil rights and for laws prohibiting discrimination. Discuss the reasons for the civil rights movement and the changes it caused in American politics and government. Describe the political and economic achievements of women in this country over time and identify some obstacles to equality that women continue to face. Okay. And summarize the struggles for equality that other groups in America have experienced. Explain what affirmative action is and why it has been so controversial. And I want to read a quote at the beginning, just because as I have learned more about history and finding out things and not taking what people say at face value, that's really the job of a historian. A historian never believes what people say. They want the footnote, they want the evidence, and that's what your paper that you're going to write is going to be about. You're going to pick a stance to argue, and you're going to tell me the evidence, the footnote, where you got it, and the facts. And that's really what studying history is all about, being objective, taking a side and knowing why. Why. So a friend of mine gave me a great quote that I wanted to read, and it's by Marie Curie, who was a scientist. And it says, "Nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less." And oftentimes, I believe in politics, different politicians feed on our fears. And I think it's really important to, if you have questions or stances on possibly the religion of Islam, the best thing you could possibly do is go and find someone who is Islamic and speak to them and talk to them about who they are and what they are and find out more firsthand, or do some research in that area. Or, if you have issues about immigration, find someone who's an immigrant and speak to them about it, or read their stories, or read their primary sources. And what I have found is it doesn't just change my mind, it just changes my objectivity. It takes away my fears about different things, and then I feel like I can have a more intelligent, a more informed answer. And I feel like the more I study history properly, with the facts, that it really opens up so much more. So anyway, as we start this chapter out in civil rights, we are going to talk about immigration. Is right off the beginning. They talk about what should we do with unauthorized immigrant children, is what they're talking about. And when I was in grad school, we read many Border Patrol stories about immigrants being treated very, very poorly, and it was really very eye-opening, especially women. And because they were illegal immigrants, it was almost like they had no rights, and that's not true. They do have rights. They are humans, and there are human rights. There are basic rights. So that was really eye-opening for me, because it really kind of shifted my views to more of solving the problem rather than fearfulness. But anyway, so it is talking about immigrants and, why they would come. More than 80% said that they were immigrating because of better economic opportunities. And then I took another class. It was called Race and Cities, and really learned the story of Texas and how actually Americans broke many laws. They were not, the U.S. Citizens were not supposed to move into Texas because it was owned by Mexico. And if you read the story about Texas, it's really interesting when you find the truth about the story of Texas and how we kind of took it away. Well, Texans took it away from Mexico. And there were laws set up, and they just bombarded right through them. So it's just really interesting. You know, one of our words that we're studying is patriotic history, and we know that a patriotic history is when we only look at the good part, the good portion of a country's history, and that it's important to look at both. Just as a person, like I used the example in the video, my children look at me and they can say all the good things about me, but it's so important for them, for me to address and to recognize the bad decisions or the tendencies I have to lose my patience or to yell too much or whatever, because that's who I am. That's the whole person, and I can't solve who I am until I know who I am. And that's the same as a country. So a country, you have to look at the whole story, not just this little section of immigration issues here, but we need to go all the way back to the beginning of the story and see what happens. And that was really eye-opening for me. Anyway, you are writing a paper, and on chapter 5, and I said in some of your other communication that at the beginning of every chapter, there are 2 stanzas. This one is, you know, against immigrant children, and then one helping the immigrant children, and you have these 2 immigration stories that are opposites. So that is a great place to look, because you might find, you know, there's gun control, for it, against it. There's all kinds of topics that you could write on. And it is an argument, and you are arguing, but you're using your objectivity and your facts and footnotes and that sort of thing. Okay. All right, so that's really very good passage here on page 97. Civil rights. Remember, they're different than civil liberties. Civil liberties is more about what the government is controlled to stay away from, to pull back from. And civil rights is the rights of all Americans to equal treatment under the law. This is more of a protection for the minorities, okay? And that was just really eye-opening for me, because in a democracy, the majority usually does not need protection. That's the whole point. The protection is for the minorities not to be lose their voice and not have, you know, a say in the government and the practices they wish. Okay. It says in the history of civil rights, the United States has had a history of discriminating various groups. Those are women, African Americans, and Native Americans dating back. This also includes people with disabilities and gay men and lesbians, all right? And, you know, that's kind of the forefront. And it's difficult when it's right and heated and it's in the media to say, okay, do these people have the same rights as I do, regardless of belief? And that's challenging when you can pull back and kind of remove the emotion, the emotional portion of it, and just look at the rights. It's difficult because you have to go on factual information. Okay, I love their definition of fundamental rights. It says a basic right of all Americans, such as the First Amendment rights, any law or action that prevents some groups or persons from exercising a fundamental right is subject to the strict scrutiny standard. And they have all the different standards: strict scrutiny, suspect, intermediate scrutiny, and that ordinary scrutiny. Okay, all right, so equal protection. All right, and then it comes down to gender stereotypes, and we're going to have some fun with that later on, because a lot of gender stereotypes are imaginary in society. And I will be very honest, I didn't always believe that, but when you begin to kind of peel back the layers of that, and we'll do some different exercises, and we're going to find out some different things. We're going to ask you to share something that you do that is not really, doesn't really align with your gender. And I am just amazed when I have classes, what students tell me. It's so eye-opening, and that you really have the freedom really to pick who and what you want to be and do. And what's really interesting, I've met quite a few male nurses recently, just with, you know, visiting different friends in the hospital, and they have been fantastic. And I live next door to a male nurse, and he is married to a female nurse, which is very interesting, and they are just amazing people. But it is really interesting on page 99. that there was a constitutional law based on gender where in 1982, which was not very long ago, there was a court decision. Mississippi's policy of excluding males from the School of Nursing and Mississippi University for women only was unconstitutional. So it does go either, it's not just women wanting to get into male careers. It's males wanting to get into careers that are traditionally, which what does that mean really? Traditionally, sometimes seen as society has set them up traditionally as being female careers, and that was struck down in 1982. That was not very long ago. Crazy. Okay, very interesting. Okay, the Equal Protection Clause was originally intended to protect the newly freed slaves, and the more you dig into what happened after the Civil War, the more absolutely disturbing it is. I would say that I was very ignorant of what went on in the South, because even though those laws were enacted, they were not enforced. They were not enforced. Now, when there were troops in the South and after the Civil War, there was some semblance of freedom for those freedmen and women. But when they were removed, and it was over presidential candidacy, it was really close, and they made a concession. They let this man win, and this man didn't, if they removed all the troops from the South. So they did that, and then, the rights of blacks just plummeted. It's really disturbing the more you read. And I'm talking about primary sources. I'm talking about evidence and letters, and yeah, so it's just really disturbing. So the 13th Amendment, which granted freedom to the slaves, was the beginning. But I love the quote someone once said to me, and it was, just because you free the slaves doesn't mean you have rid the country of slave owners. There's still people who want to control, oppress, and keep democratization from happening, which democratization is an equaling out of rights, no matter of gender, race, creed, or sexual orientation, really. So, separate but equal. They began with segregation laws, which was overturned later, but it was enforced with Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate facilities, and it was all over. It was all over railroad cars that it made it legal to have separate, as long as they were equal. Which, of course, we know later that they were almost never, ever, ever equal. But it's so neat to read on the bottom of 100 that there was one lone Supreme Court justice who said just something beautiful. And he said he was against Plessy versus Ferguson, which implemented segregation. He said, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens," which is absolute. I just loved reading that. Segregation was justified for 60 years, and then it was brought up again with the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, now how did they take away rights in different cities all across America from, even though there were laws in place? I think it's very important to look at this. And it says on page 100 there were literacy tests, and if you know, Rosa Parks was the secretary for the NAACP. She failed the literacy test 3 times. She went to college. She could read, okay? So something was going on where she could not vote unless she passed this literacy test. There were poll taxes, a tax on voting, which disenfranchised poor whites as well as blacks. The Grandfather Clause, which effectively limited voting to those whose ancestors could vote before the Civil War. Okay, if your grandfather was or ancestor was a slave, then you're out. So they did loopholes. They went by the laws, but they had all these loopholes that they were looping around. And there's a fantastic book. I was going to try and grab it off my shelf. Here it is. Oh my goodness. I got to hear this man speak. He's fantastic. It's called Slavery by Another Name. And it's by a white reporter, which normally historians do not endorse reporters, because reporters write to sell things. But this man did a great job, and he just looks into how slavery continued after the Civil War. Okay, we're almost out of time for this segment, and then in part 2, we will continue. And thank you very much.